In a roadside diner, a wealthy man finds refuge after an exhausting day. But everything changes when he witnesses a hungry little girl being brutally expelled from the place. Overwhelmed by painful memories of his childhood, he intervenes, without imagining the consequences that would follow. This encounter sparks a battle for justice that transforms lives and exposes hidden truths. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching us from. Let's continue. The afternoon was falling over the M1 motorway with that typical chill of Brighton in May, when the south wind arrives without warning and turns the sky into a curtain of grey. Robert Miller had been driving his black sedan for almost 2 hours, coming from a meeting in Canterbury, and felt the weight of the entire day on his shoulders. The tiredness was accompanied by an uneasiness he couldn't name, something that had pursued him since he left the Sunshine Community Centre that morning, where he had delivered donations and talked with the children. On the passenger seat, a small wooden box rested quietly, a gift from the children at the centre. He hadn't yet properly looked at what was inside, but he could feel the affection with which it had been made. Children's engravings covered the lid, drawings of houses, suns, and colourful hearts. Robert sighed deeply. He needed to stop, stretch his legs, grab a coffee. The diner that appeared ahead, illuminated by yellowish neon signs, seemed to serve the purpose perfectly. He parked next to 2 lorries and observed the movement. It was one of those roadside places that exist in abundance across the UK. Worn flooring, formica tables, the smell of frying oil mixed with reheated coffee. Employees hurried around, serving rushed customers who barely lifted their eyes from their phones. Robert picked up the wooden box, locked the car and went inside. The sound of voices mingled with the kitchen noise. Behind the counter, a middle-aged woman, her hair pulled back in a tight bun and a severe expression, commanded the operation with firm hands and a sharp voice. Marlene read the name tag pinned to her red apron. She dispensed orders impatiently, correcting every gesture of the servers, reprimanding any hesitation. A young, thin man with startled eyes stumbled while placing a tray on the counter and immediately received a scathing look. From the supervisor. Luke, his name. Robert noticed because he heard the woman call the young man with a tone that left no doubt about the hierarchy. The boy apologized softly and continued working, tense, like someone walking on glass. Robert sat at a table near the window, ordered a coffee and a cheese puff, and left the wooden box beside him. His thoughts wandered between the meeting figures and the voices of the children from the centre, when something on the street caught his attention. A small girl, no more than 6 or 7 years old, stood outside the diner, leaning against the wall, looking in through the glass. She wore a thin, torn blouse, worn flip-flops, and visibly shivered with the cold. Her tangled brown hair covered part of her thin face, but it didn't hide the expression of hunger and fear. Robert felt something tighten in his chest. The girl watched the display cases of sweets and savory snacks with an intensity that was painful to witness. Her eyes followed every movement of the customers, every bite of their food, every sip of their drinks. She pressed her hands together as if trying to gather courage for something. Robert frowned. Where were that child's guardians? Why was she alone there in that cold with that look of abandonment? He saw when she finally moved. The girl took 2 hesitant steps towards the door, stopped, looked around, and then entered. The bell above the door tinkled softly. She slinked inside like a frightened cat, trying not to draw attention, and walked slowly to the sweet display. Her eyes sparkled at the sight of the chocolate truffles, the cream-filled donuts, the coconut candies. She reached out her hand, almost touching the glass, when a shrill voice cut through the air. Marlene Johnson appeared like lightning. She grabbed the girl's arm forcefully, pulling her away from the display with a sudden movement that made the child let out a muffled cry. Customers looked up for an instant, but soon returned to their conversations and phones. No one wanted to get involved. The supervisor dragged the girl to the door, speaking loudly about dirty children who only came to cause trouble, about beggars who scared away customers, about how fed up she was with it all. Robert dropped his coffee on the table and stood up. Something inside him, something that came from a long time ago, from memories he preferred not to revisit, propelled him forward. He knew that look. He knew that fear. He knew what it was like to be small, invisible, disposable. He knew it because he had been that decades ago, before building everything he had today. The girl was pushed out and the door slammed shut in her face. Robert saw her stumble on the pavement, almost falling, and grab onto the lamppost to regain her balance. Marlene Johnson returned behind the counter, adjusting her apron with a sigh of someone who had just solved a problem. Luke, the young server, watched everything with an anguished expression, but said nothing. He knew the supervisor's temper too well to risk a word. Robert picked up the wooden box and walked to the door. He didn't know exactly what he was going to do, but he knew he couldn't just sit and pretend nothing had happened. When he pushed the door open and stepped out, the cold wind hit his face hard. The girl had disappeared from the pavement. He looked around, searching, and then he heard it. A low, muffled cry coming from inside the diner, again. But it wasn't from the main area. It was coming from the back. Robert went back inside, following the sound. He passed the counter, ignoring Marlene Johnson's gaze, and headed to the narrow corridor that led to the restrooms. The women's restroom door was closed. The crying was clearer now. It was a child. It was her. He knocked on the door. Sudden silence. Then a female voice. Marlene Johnson's voice, firm and impatient. She was inside. With the girl. Robert felt his blood boil. He knocked again, harder, and said he was going to open the door. The response was a child's scream, a desperate plea, a supplication that broke his heart in two. The girl begged for a piece of candy, just a tiny piece, promising she would leave, that she wouldn't come back. She just wanted something to eat. Robert waited no longer. He pushed the door with his shoulder. The lock gave way with a snap, and the door burst open violently. The scene that revealed itself burned like fire. Marlene Johnson held the girl's arm tightly, squeezing, and beside them on the floor lay a piece of a broken tray. The girl cried softly, trembling, her eyes wide with terror. Marlene Johnson released the child's arm when she saw Robert, but her expression showed no remorse. It showed anger at having been interrupted. Robert crouched down and placed his body between the supervisor and the girl. He extended his hand to the child, speaking softly, calmly, trying to soothe the terror he saw in her eyes. The girl hesitated, looking at Marlene Johnson, then at Robert, and finally grabbed his hand with desperate strength. She was trembling so much that Robert felt the cold sweat on her tiny palm. He gently pulled her closer, shielding her with his arm, and stood up, facing Marlene Johnson. "What do you think you're doing?" he asked. His voice was low, controlled, but imbued with an authority that made the woman take a step back. Marlene Johnson quickly regained her composure and began to speak. She said the girl was a troublemaker, that she constantly loitered around the diner, that she had tried to steal food before, that she was just trying to scare her to teach her a lesson. But Robert wasn't listening. He looked at the girl, at the bruises on her arm, at her frightening thinness, at the genuine fear etched on her small face. Movement in the diner had stopped. Employees and customers approached the corridor, curious, concerned. Luke stood at the front of the group, his expression divided between fear and something akin to hope. Robert looked at him and asked if he knew the girl. The young man swallowed hard, looked at Marlene Johnson, and then, gathering courage he didn't know he possessed, said yes. He saw her almost every day. She stayed nearby, always alone, always hungry, but never caused problems, never stole anything. She just looked. Marlene Johnson interrupted with a different story. Her voice rose in pitch, dramatizing. She said the girl was her ex-husband's daughter, that the child had run away from home, that she was just trying to get her back, that she was desperate, that Robert was interfering in a family matter. The girl, clinging to Robert, shook her head frantically. She said nothing, but her whole body screamed that it was a lie. Robert asked someone to call the police. Marlene Johnson tried to protest, inventing more details for her story, but now other customers began to question her. An elderly lady said she had seen the supervisor violently pushing the girl. A lorry driver confirmed it. Luke, gaining confidence, said he had never seen Marlene Johnson showing any maternal concern for the child before. On the contrary, she always threw her out. When the police arrived, 15 minutes later, Robert was still holding the girl. She wouldn't let go of his arm. She clung to him as if he were the only solid thing in a crumbling world. The police heard the versions, observed the child, noted the signs of abandonment, malnutrition, and bruises. Robert explained that he wanted to ensure immediate medical assistance, food and shelter. He mentioned the Sunshine Community Center, of which he was one of the main benefactors, and offered to accompany the entire process. Marlene Johnson tried to maintain her story, but the flaws were too evident. The police said the situation would be investigated, that social services would be notified, that the girl needed urgent care. Robert asked her name. The girl, for the first time, whispered something so low that he had to bend down to hear. Sophia. Her name was Sophia. Sophia was taken in a police car, accompanied by Robert, who insisted on not leaving her alone. He called Beatrice, the coordinator of the Sunshine Community Center, explaining the situation. Beatrice, a woman in her early 50s with gray hair and a heart the size of the world, said she would prepare everything. They had authorization for emergency shelter in situations like that. She would immediately contact the medical and psychological team. At the center, Sophia was received with extreme care. The soft lights, the walls painted with colorful murals, the gentle voices. Everything was designed not to frighten her more than she already was. The doctor who examined her frowned upon seeing the child's condition: severe malnutrition, bruises in different stages of healing, clear signs of prolonged abandonment. Sophia barely spoke, only observed everything with huge eyes, clinging to something she held tightly against her chest. It was a watch, an old broken wristwatch forever stuck at 3:15. Sophia wouldn't let go of that object for anything. When they tried to remove it to give her a bath, she panicked. Beatrice gently intervened, explaining that they could leave the watch in a safe place, very close by where she could see it. Only then did Sophia accept. That first night, Sophia slept in a soft bed for the first time in a long while. The room was small but cozy, with a window overlooking the courtyard where other children played during the day. But Sophia couldn't relax completely. She woke up at every noise, grabbed the watch, checked if everything was all right, and then tried to go back to sleep. Robert, who decided to spend the night at the center to ensure she felt safe, checked the room several times. Each time he appeared at the door, Sophia looked at him with a mixture of fear and gratitude. In the following days, the pieces of Sophia's story began to fit together through fragments she revealed in moments of trust. She spoke little, but when she did, she revealed a past too heavy for such small shoulders. Her mother had left when Sophia was very young, leaving her with her father. Her father was a kind man, she said. He worked very hard, always tired, but always made time for her. He took her for walks, told her stories, made her laugh. The watch was his. But then her father had to travel to work far away, on a construction site in another city. Before he left, he gave the watch to Sophia. He said it was for her to remember him, not to forget that he would return. But he didn't return. There was a problem at the construction site, she whispered. An accident. People came and said her father wouldn't be coming back. Sophia still hoped nonetheless. She still believed he would appear, that he would come for her, that he would bring her back home. After her father left, Sophia stayed with her stepmother. She had never liked the woman much, but now, without her father to protect her, the situation worsened. The stepmother didn't want a child. She left Sophia alone at home for days, locked away the food, yelled when Sophia cried. One day, she simply stopped coming back frequently. Sophia spent hours, sometimes entire days, alone in that cold, empty house. She started going out to look for food. That's how she discovered the diner. One of the center's volunteers, a young woman named Marina, found something inside the watch while helping Sophia clean it. There was a small hidden message written in neat handwriting on a tiny piece of paper. If you're afraid, look for the place of light. Sophia said it was her father's handwriting. Marina showed it to Beatrice, who immediately understood. Sophia's father knew about the Sunshine Community Center. Perhaps he had worked on some renovation there. Perhaps he had heard about it through someone. But he knew. He left a map for his daughter, a refuge, a safe haven. Robert, upon learning this, felt something stir within him. He wasn't a religious man, but at that moment he felt there was something greater at work. All the coincidences, all the paths that led him to that diner on that exact day at that exact time, his stopping precisely there, his seeing Sophia, his having the courage to intervene, everything seemed connected in a way he couldn't explain. Sophia began to respond to the care. She slowly gained weight. The bruises faded. Her pale skin regained color. But her eyes still carried that deep fear. She avoided direct eye contact, spoke only when asked, and spent hours sitting alone, clutching the watch, staring into space. Beatrice explained that it would take time. Such traumas didn't heal overnight. The child needed to relearn to trust, to relearn how to be a child. Robert visited every day. He brought books, toys, sweets that Sophia could eat without fear of being reprimanded. At first she merely observed everything with suspicion, touching nothing. But little by little, very gradually, she began to interact. First, she picked up an illustrated storybook. Then she tried a chocolate. And then, in a moment Robert would cherish forever, she smiled. It was a small, shy smile that lasted only a second. But it was a smile. Weeks passed, and Sophia began to open up more. She participated in the center's activities, played with other children, drew. Her drawings were always the same. A house, a large figure and a small one, a huge sun illuminating everything. Beatrice said these were good signs. Sophia was processing, she was healing, but everyone knew the road would be long. Robert, in turn, was also changing. He, who had always maintained an emotional distance from everything and everyone, who had built his fortune through coldness and calculations, who avoided deep involvements for fear of being hurt, felt something different with Sophia. There was a connection he couldn't explain. Perhaps it was because he saw in her the boy he once was. Perhaps it was because she made him remember a humanity he thought he had lost along the way. Or perhaps it was simply because, for the first time in a long time, he felt needed. Not because of money, not because of business, but because of himself. One afternoon, as Robert watched Sophia draw in the courtyard, Beatrice approached him. She asked if he had thought about the future. Social services were investigating the case, looking for relatives, checking on the stepmother's situation. But everything indicated that Sophia would remain in the center's custody until a permanent solution was found. Robert asked Beatrice what she thought. She took a deep breath and said that Sophia needed stability, a family, someone who would never abandon her again. He understood what she wasn't saying, and for the first time in his life, Robert considered something that had never crossed his mind. Adoption, having a daughter, being a father. The idea both frightened and attracted him. He had resources. He had a large, empty house. He had time. But did he have the emotional capacity? Could he be what Sophia needed? He, who had never had an example of healthy fatherhood, who had grown up alone, who didn't really know what it meant to have a family. Beatrice gently touched his arm. You don't have to decide now, but think about it. Sophia trusts you, and you, even if you don't realize it, already care for her. Sometimes life gives us chances to heal old wounds through new bonds. Robert nodded in silence. His eyes returned to Sophia, who was now laughing with another child as they played with crayons. He realized that the wooden box, the one the children had given him, was still in the car's boot. He had brought it without even knowing why. Perhaps he already knew deep down that that day would change everything. Night fell again over Brighton, and Robert finally opened the box. Inside were drawings, messages, small gifts made by the children at the center, and at the bottom a small wooden plaque with 2 words engraved. Safe haven. He smiled sadly. That's what he had been seeking his whole life, without knowing it. And that's what Sophia desperately needed. Perhaps together they could build exactly that. A safe haven. A place where neither of them would need to be afraid anymore. But while Robert reflected on future possibilities, in another corner of the city, Marlene Johnson also reflected. But her thoughts were very different. She was furious, humiliated. Her job was at risk, her reputation stained, and that girl, that cursed Sophia, was the cause of it all. Marlene Johnson picked up the phone and dialed a number she knew well. It was time to seek help, powerful help, and if she needed to destroy the community center and that man meddling in the process, she would do it without hesitation. The war was just beginning. The weeks that followed brought a new routine for Sophia, something she hadn't experienced in a long time. Waking up in a warm room with clean blankets, having breakfast guaranteed, hearing gentle voices instead of shouts. The Sunshine Community Center functioned like a living organism, pulsing with the energy of dozens of children, volunteers, and staff dedicated to transforming stories of pain into narratives of hope. Sophia was still shy. In the first few weeks, she spent a lot of time alone, watching the other children play without participating. She held the broken watch against her chest like a talisman, as if that object was the only bridge between her and the father who wouldn't return. Beatrice respected the girl's pace. She knew that healing couldn't be rushed. Each child had their rhythm, their way of processing trauma, their way of learning to trust the world again. Robert continued to appear every day. Sometimes he stayed only half an hour, other times he spent the entire afternoon. He brought small gifts that were never too big to frighten Sophia, but always chosen with care. A sketchbook with colored pencils, a teddy bear that Sophia hugged to sleep, a fairy tale book with colorful illustrations, and most importantly, he brought presents. He sat near her, spoke softly, respected her silences, smiled when she showed some reaction. One afternoon, about 3 weeks after the rescue, something changed. Robert was sitting on a courtyard bench, reading emails on his phone, when he felt a light touch on his arm. It was Sophia. She was standing there, holding a drawing. He immediately put down his phone and looked at her with full attention. Sophia extended the paper to him, still without making direct eye contact, but there was something different about her demeanor. An opening, an attempt at connection. Robert took the drawing carefully, as if it were something precious. And it was. It showed 2 figures, a large one which he presumed to be an adult and a small one. They were holding hands. Above them, a huge sun painted in yellow and orange illuminated everything. In the corner of the paper, written in shaky but neat letters, was a word. "Thank you." Robert felt his throat tighten. He looked at Sophia and said that was the most beautiful drawing he had ever received in his life. And he wasn't lying. Sophia smiled. This time it wasn't a shy smile that disappeared in seconds. It was a true smile that lit up her entire face. She asked in a tiny voice if he would come back the next day. Robert felt his heart clench in a way he couldn't explain. He replied yes, that he would come back every day as long as she needed him, and even after that too. Sophia nodded, satisfied, and ran back to the group of children playing with building blocks. Beatrice observed the scene from afar. She had known Robert for years, ever since he began to financially support the center. She had always seen him as a distant professional, man who donated generously but kept very high walls around his heart. To see those walls crumbling because of a small girl was moving and at the same time concerning. Beatrice knew that such bonds were powerful, but she also knew they could bring pain if not handled with care. She approached Robert, and the two talked at length about Sophia. The girl's legal situation was complex. Her stepmother, whose name was Vanessa, had been located by social services. She claimed that Sophia had run away, that she had tried to look for her, that she was desperate. But the evidence said otherwise. The house where Sophia lived had been abandoned for weeks. Neighbors confirmed that Vanessa rarely appeared. Some mentioned hearing a child crying, but no one had officially reported it. Social services initiated proceedings for the termination of parental rights. But these things took time. Meanwhile, Sophia would remain in the center's custody. Robert asked about relatives. Beatrice shook her head. There were no living grandparents, no aunts or uncles. Sophia's father was an only child and an orphan. Her biological mother had disappeared so long ago that no one even knew where she was. Sophia was alone, in the world, except now for the center, and for Robert. He then asked about adoption. His voice was serious, thoughtful, but there was a determination in it that Beatrice recognized. She replied that it was indeed possible. But there were many steps, assessments, interviews, social studies, hearings, and most importantly, Robert needed to be absolutely sure. Adoption was not a charity project. It was taking permanent responsibility for a life. It was becoming a real father, with all that implied. Robert said he understood, and that he was willing to go through any necessary process, because for the first time in a long time he was sure of something. He wanted Sophia to have a home, and he wanted that home to be with him. Beatrice smiled, but her smile carried worry. She mentioned that there were practical matters to consider. Sophia's father's inheritance, for example. There was a house, some savings, a life insurance policy. Everything was legally frozen until the girl's situation was resolved. If Sophia were adopted, depending on how the process was conducted, she could lose her right to these assets. Robert frowned. He didn't care about money, he had enough to take care of Sophia and give her everything she needed. But this money was her father's. It was the last thing the man had left for his daughter. It didn't seem right for her to lose it. Beatrice agreed. It was a delicate situation. She promised to consult the lawyers who volunteered with the center to better understand the options. Robert thanked her, and the two stayed watching Sophia play. She had just made a friend, a slightly older girl named Julia, who was teaching her to skip rope. Sophia kept making mistakes, stumbling, but she laughed, and that sound, that laughter, was music to Robert's ears. While the community centre became a refuge for Sophia, in another part of Brighton, in an elegant meeting room overlooking the River Thames, Marlene Johnson sat before a man who exuded power. Edward Thompson was the owner of the diner franchise where she worked. A 50-year-old businessman with grey hair slicked back, expensive suits, and a smile that never reached his eyes. He had built an empire of commercial establishments through a combination of hard work and unscrupulousness. Marlene Johnson told her version of the story. She painted Sophia as a problematic, lying child who had run away from home and caused a scandal. She said Robert was a meddler who had kidnapped the girl, falsely claiming she was being mistreated. Marlene Johnson cried, saying she only wanted to get the child back, that she was her stepdaughter, that she loved her like her own daughter. Edward Thompson listened to everything in silence, his fingers intertwined on the mahogany table. When Marlene Johnson finished, Edward Thompson remained quiet for a long moment. Then he leaned forward and said he believed her, but not because he thought she was telling the truth. He wasn't an idiot. He had known Marlene Johnson for years. He knew her explosive temper, her harshness, her impatience. But that didn't matter. What mattered was that this case was staining the reputation of his establishments. There were photos circulating on social media, articles in local blogs, comments from indignant customers, saying they would no longer return to his diners. Edward Thompson was a man who understood damage control, and he understood narrative manipulation even better. He told Marlene Johnson he would help her, not out of kindness, but because their interests were aligned. If they could turn that story around, if they could make it seem like Robert and the community centre were the villains, then his reputation would be restored, and Marlene Johnson would regain her position, perhaps even earn a bonus. But there was a price. She would have to do exactly as he commanded. Without questioning, without hesitating, Marlene Johnson immediately agreed. Edward Thompson smiled that cold smile and began to devise a plan. First, they needed a convincing narrative. The story that Sophia had been kidnapped needed to be strategically planted. Second, they needed allies in the media. Edward Thompson knew journalists who owed him favors, bloggers who would do anything for money, social media influencers who could make any narrative go viral. Third, and most importantly, they needed to discredit the Sunshine Community Centre and Robert Miller. Edward Thompson had already done his research. Robert was a successful businessman, but he kept a very private personal life. This was both good and bad. Good because there was room for insinuation, for filling gaps with malicious speculation. Bad because there were no real scandals to exploit, so they would have to manufacture doubts, question motives, suggest hidden interests, make people wonder why a wealthy, single man would suddenly take an interest in a poor girl. Edward Thompson knew that society was quick to judge, to think the worst. As for the community centre, there was more to work with. Social organizations were always vulnerable to accusations, mismanagement of funds, diversion of donations, inadequate conditions. It didn't matter if they were true or not. The important thing was to plant the seed of doubt, and once planted, that seed grew on its own, fed by human nature's tendency to believe in conspiracies, in villains, in sensational stories. Edward Thompson's plan began to unfold in the following weeks. First, an article appeared on a local sensationalist blog. The title was inflammatory. Girl allegedly rescued or kidnapped. Desperate mother seeks daughter taken by stranger. The article presented Marlene Johnson's version without any fact-checking. It included old photos of Sophia smiling next to Marlene Johnson, taken on one of the rare occasions when the girl's father had insisted on bringing the family together. The photos seemed to show a loving relationship. They didn't show what happened when the cameras were off. The article generated comments. Many doubted, but many were also outraged. How could a man just take a child? Where is the justice? Why haven't social services returned the girl to her mother? Is the community center really fit to care for children? And this Robert Miller, who is he really? What does he gain from this? Edward Thompson ensured the article was widely shared. Fake profiles were created to spread the link, to comment indignantly, to create an illusion of popular movement. Hashtags were launched. Return Sophia. Justice for Marlene. Investigate Sunshine Community Center. And it worked. The story gained traction. Other, larger outlets began to cover the case, some with more journalistic responsibility, presenting both sides. But even these ended up giving space to Marlene Johnson's version in the name of impartiality. Robert was caught by surprise. He hadn't expected that. Suddenly there were cameras at the community center's door, reporters trying to interview staff, protesters, few but noisy, with signs demanding Sophia be returned. Beatrice had to hire security. The children were frightened by all the commotion, and Sophia, who was finally beginning to feel safe, started having nightmares again. Robert gave an interview trying to clarify the facts. He explained how he found Sophia, the condition she was in, the evidence of neglect and mistreatment, but his voice, however sincere, was lost in the noise. Edward Thompson ensured that every word Robert said was cut, edited, taken out of context. A comment about Sophia being better off now at the center was twisted into Robert admitting he took the girl from her mother. A mention of Sophia's injuries was framed as an exaggeration to justify a kidnapping. The pressure increased when Edward Thompson used his contacts to provoke surprise inspections at the community center. Regulatory bodies appeared without warning, searching every corner, looking for irregularities. And although the Sunshine Community Center was exemplary in its practices, there were always technical details that could be questioned. A delayed document here. A protocol not strictly followed there. Nothing serious, but enough to generate reports that Edward Thompson could use to fuel the narrative that the center was problematic. Beatrice was exhausted. She had dedicated 20 years of her life to the Sunshine Community Center. She had seen dozens of children rescued from horrific situations and transformed into healthy adults. And now, everything she had built was being attacked because of lies. She talked to Robert about the possibility of temporarily handing Sophia over to state social services just until things calmed down. But Robert vehemently refused. Handing Sophia over now would be to confirm the accusations. It would be abandoning her precisely when she most needed stability. He was right, but the situation was becoming increasingly untenable. Donors began to pull away, concerned about the association with a scandal. Volunteers hesitated to continue. The children themselves felt the tension in the air. And then, when it seemed things couldn't get worse, they did. A new staff member arrived at the center. Her name was Patricia, and she had come with excellent references. Trained in pedagogy, experienced in child trauma, warm and dedicated, Beatrice hired her to strengthen the team, specifically caring for Sophia. Patricia proved attentive from the start. She spent hours with Sophia, talking, playing, earning the girl's trust. Sophia, lacking female affection, quickly became attached. Patricia seemed to understand her in a way no one else could. She didn't pressure, didn't rush, she was just present. Sophia began to open up more to her, telling her things about her father, about life before, about her fears. Patricia listened attentively, noted details, asked gentle but targeted questions. No one suspected. Why would they? Patricia was everything a professional should be, but one afternoon, about 2 weeks after her arrival, she started a different conversation with Sophia. They were alone in the activity room, drawing together, when Patricia asked if Sophia didn't miss home. Sophia said she no longer had a home. Patricia gently pressed. "And the woman who looked after you, she must be worried. She must be suffering." Sophia became confused. She said that woman didn't care for her, that she left her alone, that she was mean. Patricia superficially agreed, but then began to plant doubts. Sometimes adults do wrong things when they're tired, when they're suffering, when they have problems. That doesn't mean they don't love. Perhaps that woman loved Sophia but didn't know how to show it properly. Perhaps she wanted a chance to improve, to be a real family. Sophia didn't know what to think. She liked Patricia, trusted her. If Patricia said that, maybe it was true. Maybe her stepmother really did love her in some strange way. Patricia's words echoed in Sophia's mind, mixing with memories, creating confusion where there had once been clarity. The girl began to become quieter again. She started having trouble sleeping. When Robert appeared, she no longer ran to hug him. She stayed, distant, thoughtful, lost in thoughts that hurt her. Robert noticed the change and became worried. He talked to Beatrice, who had also sensed something was wrong. They called in the psychologist who was working with Sophia, Dr. Felicity Davies, a 40-year-old woman specializing in child trauma. Felicity spent a long session with Sophia, trying to understand what was happening. Sophia didn't speak clearly, but she mentioned things Patricia had said. About her stepmother perhaps loving her, about giving a second chance, about family. Felicity felt an alarm bell ring. That wasn't appropriate therapy. It was manipulation. She reported her concerns immediately. Beatrice decided to investigate Patricia more deeply. She asked a social worker to recheck her references, and that's when they found out. The references were fake. The places where Patricia claimed to have worked had no record of her. The diploma was from an institution that didn't even exist. Patricia was a fraud. Beatrice confronted Patricia in a private room, with Robert and the social worker present. Patricia tried to maintain her facade at first, but when she realized she was cornered, she dropped the mask. She said she had been hired by Marlene Johnson. Her job was to get close to Sophia, confuse the girl, make her question whether she was really better off there or if it wouldn't be better to go back. It was all part of the plan to regain custody. Patricia showed no remorse. She said it was just a job, that she needed the money, that she hadn't done anything illegal. Robert felt a fury he hadn't experienced in years, but he controlled himself. Shouting wouldn't solve anything. They needed proof. The social worker managed to audio record Patricia's confession with legal authorization. Beatrice dismissed Patricia immediately and contacted the center's lawyers. This was serious. It was attempted witness tampering, obstruction of a child protection process. It could have serious consequences for Marlene Johnson and anyone else involved. But the damage was already done. Sophia was traumatized again. She didn't fully understand what had happened. She only knew that another person she had trusted had deceived her. She withdrew again, stopped speaking, spent hours clutching the watch, rocking back and forth, reliving old traumas and creating new ones. Dr. Felicity Davies said they would need to restart part of the treatment, that Sophia would have to relearn, again, to trust. And that, this time it would be harder. Robert felt powerless. He, who had always solved problems with money and negotiations, now didn't know how to fix this. There was no contract he could sign, no deal he could close to take away Sophia's pain. He could only be present, sit beside her, hold her hand when she allowed it, whisper that he was there, that he wasn't leaving, that she was safe. On one of those nights, Sophia finally spoke. She asked why people were mean, why they wanted to hurt her, what she had done wrong. Robert felt his heart break. He hugged Sophia and said she hadn't done anything wrong, that sometimes people did bad things for reasons that had nothing to do with her, that the world could be difficult and unfair, but that there was also kindness, and that he would prove it to her, every day for as long as it took. Sophia fell asleep in his arms that night. Robert stayed there, holding her, feeling the small weight of her tired body against his chest, and for the first time he allowed tears to stream down his face. Tears for Sophia, tears for the boy he had been, whom no one had protected. Tears for the injustice of it all, but also tears for something new being born within him, a purpose, an iron determination. He wouldn't let them take Sophia. He wouldn't allow them to hurt her anymore. Whatever the cost, he would fight, and he would win. The discovery that Patricia was a spy planted by Marlene Johnson had immediate repercussions. The community center's lawyers, led by Dr. Augustus Riley, a 60-year-old man who dedicated part of his time to social causes, filed a formal petition documenting the attempted manipulation. That changed the game. It was no longer just a custody dispute. It was a clear demonstration of bad faith and an attempt to obstruct justice. But Edward Thompson was not a man to back down easily. When he learned of Patricia's confession and the recording obtained, he intensified his efforts. If he couldn't get Sophia back through subtle manipulation, he would try through brute legal force. He hired the best lawyers money could buy, men and women specialized in turning impossible cases around, in transforming culprits into victims and victims into suspects. Edward Thompson's strategy was multifaceted. On one hand, he continued to feed the media with stories that painted Marlene Johnson as a desperate mother, wronged by a flawed system and by a rich man who used his influence to steal a child. On the other, his lawyers began working behind the scenes, looking for legal loopholes, pressuring authorities, using every political connection Edward Thompson had cultivated over decades of building his empire. It was during this period that crucial information reached Edward Thompson's ears. Through an accountant who had access to public records, he discovered Sophia's father's inheritance. It wasn't a fortune, but it was substantial. A house in an affluent district of Brighton, savings accumulated over years of work, and a considerable life insurance policy. Everything legally frozen until Sophia's situation was resolved. Edward Thompson saw there not only a financial motivation to push for custody, but also a weapon to use against Robert and the centre. He could argue that the centre had a financial interest in keeping Sophia, that Robert, as the centre's main benefactor, would also indirectly benefit, that the entire rescue was nothing more than a ploy to gain access to that money. It didn't matter that the amount was negligible compared to Robert's wealth. It didn't matter that the centre didn't even know about this clause until now. What mattered was the narrative, and narratives didn't need to be true to be effective. Edward Thompson planted the story through his press contacts. Inheritance scandal involving community centre and businessmen. The headlines were calculated to generate outrage, and they worked. Social media comments exploded. "Ah, so that's what it was. There's always a financial interest. No one does anything out of kindness. Give the girl back to her real mother." Robert learned of the story through Beatrice, who was pale when she called him. She had just received a call from the centre's lawyers explaining about the inheritance clause. Beatrice didn't even know it existed. Sophia's father must have included the Sunshine Community Centre as a beneficiary because he knew their work, because he trusted them. But now that was being used to destroy them. Robert immediately met with Dr. Augustus Riley and the legal team. They needed a quick and transparent response. Dr. Augustus Riley suggested that they publicly disclose the discovery of the clause, explaining that they had no prior knowledge of it, and that they formally renounced any rights to Sophia's inheritance. Robert agreed, but went further. He publicly announced that regardless of the case's outcome, he would personally ensure Sophia received every penny of her father's inheritance, and that if necessary, he himself would create a trust fund to manage these resources until Sophia reached adulthood. Robert's statement helped calm part of public opinion, but the damage was already done. The seed of doubt had been planted and was quickly germinating. And Edward Thompson didn't stop. He discovered that the process of terminating Marlene Johnson's parental rights was advancing, and an important hearing was scheduled soon. He needed something big to turn the tide. He needed evidence, testimony, something that could completely dismantle Robert's version. That's when Edward Thompson had an idea. He knew people who could fabricate documents, people who could create stories, and he had money to ensure these people did the job right. He commissioned fake documents showing that Marlene Johnson had formal legal custody of Sophia, signed and dated before the diner incident. They were good forgeries, made by professionals who knew exactly how to replicate stamps, signatures, official papers. With these documents in hand, Edward Thompson's lawyers filed an urgent petition demanding that Sophia be immediately returned to her legal guardian. They argued that the community center was illegally retaining a child, that Robert had interfered in a family matter without authority to do so, and that every day Sophia spent away from Marlene Johnson was an additional day of trauma for the girl. The judge who would hear the case, Judge Ferdinand Palmer, was known for being rigorous but fair. He scheduled a preliminary hearing to evaluate the petition. The tension at the community center was palpable. Beatrice was exhausted, with deep dark circles under her eyes, trying to maintain a normal routine for the children while dealing with the legal chaos. The staff were worried, and Sophia, poor Sophia, felt all that heavy energy around her without understanding what was happening. Robert spent more and more time at the center. He had delegated his businesses to trusted managers because his priority was now elsewhere. It was to ensure Sophia remained safe. It was to fight for her. He talked at length with Dr. Augustus Riley, preparing for the hearing. They had medical reports, psychological evaluations, testimonies from neighbors about Marlene Johnson's neglect. But Edward Thompson's lawyers also had their own weapons. And, in a legal battle, it wasn't always the one who was right who won. Sometimes it was the one who had more resources, more skill in manipulating the system, more willingness to play dirty. It was Luke, the young diner attendant, who changed everything. He had followed the case in the media, feeling increasingly guilty. He had seen Sophia so many times. He had perceived her suffering, and he had done nothing until that day. Now, seeing how things were unfolding, he decided he needed to do more. Luke remembered that the diner had security cameras. There weren't many, and the quality wasn't great, but they existed. And one of them covered the corridor leading to the restrooms. He had thought about this before, but didn't know how to proceed. Until he read about the scheduled hearing. He needed to act. He needed to try. Luke sought out Robert through the community center's social media. He sent a message explaining who he was and saying he might have something important. Robert replied immediately and scheduled a meeting. They met at a cafe in the center of Brighton, far from the diner, in a place where Luke felt safe to speak. The young man was nervous. He had left his job at the diner weeks ago, no longer able to work for Marlene Johnson after everything that had happened. But he had done something before leaving. He had copied the security camera recordings from the day of the incident. He didn't know if it was legal, if it could be used, if it would be useful for anything, but he felt he had to do it. Robert listened with increasing attention. A recording, real, concrete evidence of what happened that day. He immediately called Dr. Augustus Riley. The lawyer analyzed the situation. Luke's obtaining the recording was irregular, yes, but he was an employee of the diner at the time. He had legitimate access to the system, and more importantly, the recording showed a possible case of child mistreatment. There were legal precedents that allowed the use of such evidence in child protection cases, even if obtained unconventionally. They watched the recording together. The quality wasn't cinematic, but it was clear enough. It showed Marlene Johnson grabbing Sophia forcefully, dragging her down the corridor, pushing her into the restroom. It didn't show the inside of the restroom, but the audio captured sounds. Marlene Johnson's voice, loud and aggressive, Sophia's cries, and then Robert appearing, forcing the door open, rescuing the girl. Dr. Augustus Riley smiled for the first time in weeks. That was exactly what they needed. It was irrefutable proof that Sophia was being mistreated, that Robert acted correctly in intervening, that Marlene Johnson's entire narrative was false. They needed to authenticate the recording, ensure it was accepted as legal evidence. But that was technical. Dr. Augustus Riley knew how to do it. Robert thanked Luke sincerely. The young man had risked a lot by keeping that recording, by coming to them. Luke merely shook his head. He said he should have done more from the beginning, that he had seen Sophia so many times and hadn't acted. That perhaps by doing this now, he could make up for it a little. Robert said he was doing the right thing, and that Sophia would be grateful when she was older and understood everything. The legal team worked frantically to prepare the recording for presentation in court. They hired a digital forensic expert to authenticate the video, ensuring there was no manipulation, that the date and time were correct, that it was legitimate. The expert did his work meticulously and issued a technical report confirming authenticity. Meanwhile, Edward Thompson wasn't idle. He learned through his sources that something was being prepared by the center's defense. He didn't know exactly what, but he smelled trouble. He instructed his lawyers to prepare counter-arguments for any evidence that might emerge, and he also activated his Plan B. If things went bad in court, he had an escape. He could claim that Marlene Johnson had deceived him, that he had acted in good faith based on the information she provided. He could quickly distance himself from her. Men like Edward Thompson always had a lifeboat. The hearing was scheduled for a rainy Thursday in June. The sky over Brighton was heavy, laden, as if nature itself reflected the tension of the moment. The central courthouse was busy, with lawyers, parties, and witnesses moving through its marble corridors. Robert arrived early with Dr. Augustus Riley and the center's team. Beatrice was there, dressed in a sober suit, her hair tied back, trying to appear more confident than she felt. Dr. Felicity Davies, Sophia's psychologist, was also present to testify if necessary. Luke had come, although he was extremely nervous. It was his first time stepping into a courtroom. On the other side, Marlene Johnson arrived surrounded by Edward Thompson's lawyers. She wore carefully chosen clothes to convey an image of a worried and suffering mother. Her hair was neatly styled, her makeup subtle but not hiding a deliberately dull face, as if she hadn't slept for days out of concern. It was a performance, all calculated. Edward Thompson stayed outside the courtroom. He was not officially part of the proceedings, merely a supporter of Marlene Johnson. But his lead lawyer, Dr. Clayton Newman, was there. A tall man wearing glasses, with an eloquent voice and an impressive ability to distort facts. He had won impossible cases before. He was confident he would win this one too. Judge Ferdinand Palmer entered the room, and everyone stood. He was a 55-year-old man, with grey hair, a serious but not cruel expression. He had a reputation for being fair and not easily impressed by lawyers' dramatics. He was there to find the truth and do what was best for the child. Nothing more. The hearing began with the petitions. Dr. Clayton Newman presented the forged documents showing that Marlene Johnson had legal custody of Sophia. He eloquently argued that a mother was being unjustly separated from her daughter, that the community center had a financial interest in the case due to the inheritance, that Robert Miller had acted impulsively without understanding the full situation. Dr. Augustus Riley listened to everything in silence, taking notes. When his turn came, he calmly stood up and began to dismantle each argument. First, he presented documents proving that Marlene Johnson's custody papers were fake. The handwriting expert he had hired identified inconsistencies in the signatures, anachronisms in the stamps, subtle but revealing errors that proved forgery. Dr. Clayton Newman tried to object, but the judge called for silence and personally examined the reports. His expression grew increasingly serious. Document forgery was a serious crime. If those papers were indeed fake, someone would have to answer for it. Next, Dr. Augustus Riley called witnesses. Sophia's neighbors testified about the neglect. The doctor who examined her presented detailed reports on her malnutrition and injuries. Dr. Felicity Davies explained Sophia's psychological state when she arrived at the center and how she improved with proper care. Each testimony built a clear and devastating picture of the reality Sophia had lived. Dr. Clayton Newman tried to counter-argue, suggesting that Sophia could have been injured in other ways, that malnutrition didn't prove mistreatment, that everything could be interpreted differently, but his words sounded increasingly weak. And then Dr. Augustus Riley played his final card. He presented the recording. The room fell silent as the video was played. Even with the mediocre quality, it was impossible not to see. Marlene Johnson brutally grabbing Sophia, dragging her, the screams, the cries. Robert intervening, the raw, undeniable truth, impossible to deny or reinterpret. Marlene Johnson paled. Dr. Clayton Newman shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He requested a recess to consult with his client. The judge granted 15 minutes. During this break, Dr. Clayton Newman had a heated, whispered conversation with Marlene Johnson. She insisted she could explain, that it was out of context, that she was merely disciplining the child. But the lawyer knew there was no way to win this. The recording was devastating. When the hearing resumed, Dr. Clayton Newman adopted a new strategy. He no longer tried to defend Marlene Johnson's actions. Instead, he argued for clemency, for a chance at rehabilitation, for psychological support. He suggested that Marlene Johnson was going through a difficult period, that she was not in her normal mental state, that she deserved help and not punishment. Judge Ferdinand Palmer heard everything. Then he asked to see the recording again, and again. He asked Marlene Johnson direct questions. Why did you do that? Was the girl stealing? Was she threatening you? Marlene Johnson stammered incoherent replies. She couldn't justify the unjustifiable. Finally, the judge delivered his ruling. His voice was firm, laden with authority and disappointment. He said he had seen many cases in his career, but few as clear as this one. The recording left no doubt. Sophia was being mistreated. Robert Miller acted correctly in intervening. The community center was providing adequate care. And Marlene Johnson had not only neglected a child under her responsibility, but also attempted to manipulate the legal system with forged documents. The judge immediately ordered the permanent termination of Marlene Johnson's parental rights over Sophia. He ordered that temporary custody remain with the Sunshine Community Center, with strict supervision from social services. He also ordered a police investigation to determine who fabricated the forged documents and if there were others involved in the attempt to obstruct justice. Marlene Johnson left the courtroom escorted, pale and defeated. Dr. Clayton Newman abandoned her right there, already thinking about how to distance himself from that disaster. And Edward Thompson, who was following everything by phone, made his decision immediately. He called his lawyers and instructed them to cut all ties with Marlene Johnson, to claim that he had been deceived, that he acted in good faith, to keep him out of it before the investigations reached him. Robert, Beatrice, and the entire team left the courtroom exhausted, but victorious. They had won. Sophia was safe. The truth had prevailed. Luke, who had watched everything with teary eyes, was embraced by Robert. Without that recording, none of this would have been possible. He had been the silent hero of that story. News of the court's decision spread rapidly. Public opinion, so quick to condemn, was equally quick to change sides. Now everyone spoke about Robert's courageous intervention, about the wonderful work of the community center, about justice finally being served. The same social media outlets that attacked now apologized. The same news outlets that spread doubts now praised. It was human nature, fickle and forgetful, but not everything was resolved. Because now came the most difficult part, explaining everything to Sophia, helping her understand what had happened, and deciding what would come next. Because temporary custody was not a permanent solution, Sophia needed a home. She needed a family. And Robert knew deep down in his heart what he wanted to do, but he also knew it wasn't just about what he wanted. It was about what was best for Sophia, and sometimes those two things weren't the same. The weeks following the hearing brought a strange calm. It was as if after so much storm the silence was deafening. The media had lost interest in the case. Marlene Johnson left Brighton, no one knew where to. Edward Thompson managed to stay clear of the investigations, using his ability to always be one step behind concrete evidence. The community center returned to its routine, and the children, resilient as only children know how to be, continued playing, learning, growing. But Sophia still carried the scars. She understood vaguely that something important had happened, that there was a court, that decisions had been made, that she no longer needed to fear being taken away. But intellectual understanding was different from truly feeling. Safe? Every loud noise still made her jump. Every new face put her on alert, and every night, without exception, she still slept clutching her father's broken watch. Robert was there every day. He had practically moved into the center, spending mornings, afternoons, and often nights there. His businesses continued to operate, but he had delegated almost everything. His focus was elsewhere. It was on Sophia, on helping her recover, on showing her that not all people disappeared, that some stayed, that he would stay. Dr. Felicity Davies continued working with Sophia weekly. The sessions were gentle, never forcing, always, respecting the girl's pace. Through drawings, games, fragmented conversations, Sophia began to process the trauma. The psychologist explained to Robert that children had an incredible capacity for healing when given the right environment. Sophia was in that environment now. With time, patience, and love, she would recover. And slowly, Sophia began to blossom. First, there were small changes. She started participating more in group activities. She befriended Julia, the girl who had taught her to skip rope, and now the two were inseparable. Sophia returned to drawing, and her drawings changed. Before, they were always somber, with dark colors, isolated, figures. Now there were vibrant colors, bright suns, people together. She also started calling Robert Uncle Rob. It wasn't something anyone suggested. It was something that arose naturally, one ordinary day. Robert was helping her with a puzzle when Sophia, concentrating on the pieces, casually said, "Uncle Rob, does this piece go here?" He froze for a second, his heart racing. Then he smiled and said yes, it went there. And from that moment on, he was Uncle Rob. Beatrice observed everything with a mix of joy and concern. She saw the bond between Robert and Sophia deepening every day. She saw how Sophia's eyes sought Robert when he entered a room. She saw how she ran to show him every drawing, every achievement, every thought. And she also saw how Robert was completely transformed. The cold, distant man she had known years ago no longer existed. In his place was someone who laughed, who played, who allowed himself to feel. But Beatrice also knew that this situation was temporary. Sophia was in the center's custody, but that wasn't permanent. Eventually, a long-term solution would need to be found. Adoption, foster family, something. And although she knew exactly what the best solution was, she also knew she couldn't force it. Robert needed to come to that decision on his own, and Sophia, when she was ready, would also have to make her choice. One July afternoon, as the Brighton winter showed its coldest side, Beatrice called Robert to talk. They sat in her small office with hot tea steaming in ceramic cups. Beatrice was direct. Social services were pressing for a decision. Sophia was doing well at the center, but the situation needed to be resolved. There were registered families interested in adoption. Good families. People who would give Sophia love and structure. Robert felt something tighten in his chest. The idea of Sophia going to another family, of not seeing her every day, of not being part of her life, was almost unbearable. But he was also terrified of the alternative. Adopting Sophia meant taking on permanent responsibility. It meant being a father. And he didn't know if he could do it. He didn't know if he would be good at it. He didn't know if Sophia wouldn't deserve someone better, someone who truly knew how to be a father. Beatrice placed her hand on Robert's. She said she understood his fears, that every father, even biological ones, had those fears. No one was born knowing how to be a father. It was something learned by doing, by making mistakes and getting it right. But love was the foundation, and Robert clearly loved Sophia. Anyone who saw the two of them together could see it. Sometimes the heart knew before the head, and sometimes it was necessary to trust the heart. Robert returned home that night with his head spinning. His house, which was once his refuge, now seemed empty and cold. He looked around. There was space to spare, empty rooms, a garden he never used, an equipped kitchen where he rarely cooked. Everything there was waiting to be filled, waiting for life, waiting, perhaps, for Sophia. He thought about his own past, how he had been an abandoned child, moving through institutions, being adopted late by a couple who raised him with strictness, but not with affection. He had never truly felt part of that family, never felt at home. And he swore to himself that if he ever had children, they would feel loved, they would feel cherished, they would feel at home. Sophia was his chance to fulfill that promise, not just for her but for the boy he had been, for all the children who grew up feeling unloved. He could change that for Sophia. He could give her the home he never had. He could be the father he had wished for, and perhaps in the process he could heal parts of himself that remained broken. But there was a complication: the inheritance. Robert had consulted lawyers specializing in inheritance law. The situation was complex. If Robert adopted Sophia, depending on how the process was structured, she could lose the right to her biological father's inheritance. The laws were clear in some aspects, nebulous in others. There were ways to protect the assets, but they weren't guaranteed, and Robert didn't want Sophia to lose what her father had left. That was important. It was her last connection to the man who loved her. He spent sleepless nights thinking of solutions. He consulted more lawyers, talked with social workers, explored all options, and he realized there was no perfect answer. Any path he chose would have a cost. But what cost was acceptable? It was Dr. Augustus Riley who brought a different perspective. They were having lunch when Robert presented his dilemma. The lawyer listened to everything, thought for a moment, and then asked, "What do you think Sophia's father would value more? The money he left, or the assurance that his daughter would have a loving family?" Robert fell silent. The answer was obvious. Any father would choose the second option. Dr. Augustus Riley continued, "That man left a message on the watch. Look for the place of light. He wanted his daughter to be cared for. He wanted her to have a safe haven. If he knew you could give her that, do you think he would care about the money?" Robert shook his head. "No, Sophia's father would want her to be loved. He would want her to be happy. The money was secondary." But there was another person whose opinion mattered more than anyone else's. Sophia. She was 7 years old now, no longer that terrified girl he had found in the diner months ago. She was growing, becoming stronger, more secure. She deserved a voice in this. She deserved to understand, as much as possible, what was at stake. And she deserved to choose. Robert talked to Dr. Felicity Davies about how to approach the subject with Sophia. The psychologist suggested doing it gradually, through light conversations, using age-appropriate language. First, establish what Sophia felt. Then, explain the options. And finally, let her express her wishes. The conversations took place over several weeks. Robert asked Sophia about what made her happy. She replied, playing with Julia, drawing, the stories Uncle Rob told. He asked where she would like to live. She said she liked the center, but sometimes she dreamed of a house with a garden, where she could have a dog. He asked if she missed anyone. She replied that she missed her father, but knew he wouldn't return, and that now she had Uncle Rob, and Beatrice, and Julia. She had a new family. Family. The word Sophia used naturally, without weight, without fear. Robert realized that for her, family was no longer about blood or legal papers. It was about who was present, who cared, who loved, and he was on that list. Perhaps at the top of that list. One August afternoon, with the sun finally warming Brighton again, Robert gathered his courage. He took Sophia to a park, just the two of them. They walked, ate ice cream, played on the swings. And then, sitting on a bench under a tree, Robert held Sophia's small hands and said he needed to talk about something important. Sophia looked at him with those huge eyes, still carrying shadows of the past, but also shining with present confidence. Robert explained in simple words that she couldn't stay at the center forever, that she would eventually need a permanent home, that there were families who wanted to adopt her, to give her love. Sophia remained quiet, processing. Then she asked if Uncle Rob was also leaving. Robert felt his throat tighten. He said no, that he would never leave, that he would always be there for her, but that Sophia deserved more than visits. She deserved a true family, a father or a mother who would be there every night, every morning, forever. Sophia asked if Uncle Rob could be that father. And there in that park, with birds singing and children playing around, Robert felt tears stream down his face. He said he wanted to, more than anything, but that there was a problem, that her father, her real father, had left things for her, a house, money, and that if Robert adopted her, perhaps she would lose those things, and he didn't think it was fair. Sophia remained silent for a long time. Then she took the watch from inside her blouse, where she always carried it. She looked at the watch, at the hands forever stuck at 3:15, and she said something Robert would never forget. She said her father left the most important thing. He left a message saying to look for the place of light. And she looked, and she found it. She found the center. She found Beatrice. She found Uncle, Rob. Her father wanted her to be safe, and she was safe, with Uncle Rob. The rest, the house, the money, were just things, and things didn't matter as much as people. Robert hugged Sophia and cried. He cried for her. He cried for himself. He cried for the man he had been and for the man he was becoming. He cried for the simple beauty of that moment, of that child teaching him lessons he had taken a lifetime not to learn. When they finally separated, Sophia was smiling. She asked if that meant Uncle Rob was going to be her real father. Robert said yes if she wanted him to be. Sophia nodded enthusiastically. She wanted him to be. The adoption process was formally initiated in the following weeks. Robert went through all the necessary assessments, home visits, psychological interviews, social studies. He opened his life, his home, his heart for inspection. And he passed everything. Because it was genuine, because he truly loved Sophia, and because Sophia also loved him. The inheritance issue was resolved in the best possible way. The lawyers structured a trust fund that would protect Sophia's father's assets until she turned 18. It wasn't perfect, and there was still some legal uncertainty, but it was the best they could do. Robert also created an additional fund with his own resources, ensuring Sophia would have financial security independent of any future legal decision. But the most important thing wasn't the money, it was the home that was being built. Robert completely renovated one of the bedrooms in his house. He let Sophia choose the colors, the furniture, the decoration. She chose yellow walls, like the sun in her drawings. She chose a canopy bed that made her feel like a princess. She chose shelves for her books and her drawings. And she hung on the main wall her favorite drawing, the one that showed two figures holding hands under a radiant sun. The adoption was finalized in a simple ceremony at the courthouse, in the presence of Beatrice, Dr. Felicity Davies, Dr. Augustus Riley, Luke, and some children from the center who had become Sophia's friends. Julia was there, holding Sophia's hand throughout the process. Judge Ferdinand Palmer, the same judge who presided over the previous hearing, conducted the ceremony. He looked at Robert and Sophia and said he had seen the beginning of that story in the worst of times, and that it was a privilege to witness the end in the best of times. When the judge declared the adoption complete, Sophia officially became Sophia Miller. She had a new surname, a new home, a new father. But there was nothing new about the feelings that had already existed for months. The paperwork merely confirmed what the heart already knew. The celebration was held at the community center, where it all began. There was cake, decorations, laughter. The children played in the courtyard. The adults talked, emotional. Robert held Sophia in his lap. She was getting a bit too big for it, but neither of them minded. Beatrice approached with the wooden box, the one the children had given Robert months ago. Robert had kept the box, but had never really explored its full contents. Beatrice suggested that he and Sophia look together. They sat in a quiet corner and opened the box. Inside were drawings, messages of affection from the children, small handcrafted gifts, and at the bottom, that small wooden plaque. Safe Haven. Sophia picked up the plaque and read the words slowly, still getting used to reading. Safe Haven. She asked what it meant. Robert explained that it was a place, a person, a feeling, where you knew you were protected, where you didn't have to be afraid, where you could be yourself, where you were loved unconditionally. Sophia looked at Robert with eyes too wise for her age, and she said she understood. She said her father had tried to be her safe haven, and that when her father left, she felt lost. But that the message on the watch guided her to the center, to Beatrice, and most importantly to Robert. He was her safe haven now. And she, Robert realized at that moment, was also his. The following months brought a new and wonderful routine. Sophia going to school, Robert helping with homework, dinners together, weekends at the park. Sophia started art classes, discovering an impressive talent for painting. Her paintings filled the house, colors exploding everywhere. Robert framed each one, hanging them with pride. They adopted a dog, a stray found by Sophia on a walk one day. She named him Sul, in homage to the center that changed her life. Sul became the third member of the family, a faithful companion and an inexhaustible source of joy. Sophia still had her difficult moments, occasional nightmares, days when memories returned, but now she had the structure to deal with it. She had Dr. Felicity Davies, she had Robert, she had a home where she could feel, process, heal. And little by little the difficult days became rarer, the smiles more frequent. Robert gradually returned to business, but with a completely different perspective. He was still successful, still made strategic decisions, but now there was balance. He never missed Sophia's school presentations, never let meetings be more important than being home for dinner. He had learned what truly mattered. He also became more active in the community center, not just as a donor but as a volunteer. Beatrice put him to help with other children, especially those with stories similar to Sophia's. Robert discovered he had a knack for it, that his experience, both personal and professional, could make a difference. He helped children find themselves again, and in the process, he continued to find himself too. The center grew, received new projects, expanded its facilities. Sophia became a kind of mascot, a living success story. She helped with new children, especially the most frightened ones. She told them she understood, that she had also been afraid, but that it was safe there, that there in the place of light, people cared for each other. One special afternoon, almost a year after the adoption, Robert organized something. He took Sophia back to a roadside diner, not the same one where everything happened, that one had closed, but a similar one. They sat down, ordered snacks, talked. Sophia didn't have flashbacks. She wasn't scared. It was just a place now. The power that kind of place had over her was broken. Luke was also there at Robert's invitation. He had a new job now in a better place and was studying at night to finish high school. Seeing Sophia happy, healthy, loved, made it all worthwhile for him. Robert thanked Luke again for the courage he had shown. Without that recording, without that evidence, things could have been very different. They took a photo together, Robert, Sophia, and Luke. 3 people whom life had brought together in an improbable way. 3 people who proved that a single choice, a single courageous action, could change everything. Robert had that photo framed and hung it in the living room alongside Sophia's drawings. At home that night, while Sophia brushed her teeth before bed, Robert looked around. The house was full now, full of life, full of child's clutter, full of laughter and stories and love, so different from the emptiness it was before, and he wouldn't trade it for anything. Sophia appeared in her pajamas, holding her father's watch. She still carried it, but not with desperation. Now, it was a good memory. A connection to the past that no longer hurt. She climbed into bed and Robert tucked her in, saying good night. Sophia held his hand for a moment and said thank you, for everything, for stopping at that diner, for seeing her, for staying. Robert kissed her forehead and said it was he who thanked her, because by saving Sophia, she had also saved him, saved the parts of him that were lost, taught him what family, love, and home meant, showed him that it was never too late to start over, to be better, to be happy. Sophia smiled, almost asleep. She whispered one last thing before closing her eyes. Daddy. She called him Daddy now. Not every day, still shy with the word. But when she did, it made Robert's heart explode with joy. He left the room, leaving the door ajar as Sophia liked. He went down to the living room where Sul was curled up on the sofa. Robert sat down, picked up the wooden box he always kept nearby, and looked once more at the plaque. Safe haven, that which he and Sophia had built together. The phone rang. It was Beatrice calling to inform him about a new child at the center. A 5-year-old boy, found in a difficult situation. She asked if Robert could help, perhaps talk to the boy, share a little hope. Robert said yes. Of course he would. He would be there tomorrow morning, because what he had learned, what Sophia had taught him, was too valuable not to share. Everyone deserved a safe haven. Everyone deserved to feel loved. And if he could help even one child feel that, then it would all be worth it. Robert went upstairs to check on Sophia one last time before bed. She was peaceful, breathing softly, a small smile on her face. Saul was now at the foot of her bed, standing guard. Everything was fine. Everything was, finally, at peace. And in that house that night, under the brightened sky, a family slept safely. A family not born of blood ties, but of choices, of courage, of love. A family that proved that sometimes the strongest connections are those we choose to create. And that home is not where you are born, it's where you are loved. End of story. Dear listeners, we hope that Robert and Sophia's story has deeply touched your hearts. If you were moved by this journey of overcoming adversity, love, and new beginnings, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments which moment stood out to you the most. Was it the rescue at the diner, the victory in court, or that final moment where Sophia called Robert Daddy? Every day we bring intense stories like this, which reveal the most human and true side of each of us. Stories about family, forgiveness, transformation, and hope. We look forward to seeing you in the next episode, where another emotional narrative will make you reflect on what truly matters in life.